Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us to this event on the death penalty, use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses. I would like to first thank Harm Reduction International to organizing this event with the support of a long list of co-sponsors. So I'm not going to name everyone, but thank you very much for your support. Also, this is the second program, a human rights program we are organizing at the CND 67 session, taking within the framework of the UN Human Rights Report on drug policy, which was published last year. Among 7 programs, this is one of the programs we are organizing. Let me start with a few words on the issue of death penalty. Just today, we are going to hear from our colleague Ajeng with regard to their new report on the death penalty for drug offenses, which just has been, we're going to launch it today. And she will give us some briefing on update on the situation, global situation with regard to death penalty. But I would like to refer to our report in which we articulated that death penalty in recent time has been, use of the death penalty of the recent time or imposition of the death penalty as recent time has increased for the drug-related offenses. Drug offenses can never serve as the basis for the imposition of the death penalty. States that have not abolished the death penalty yet may impose it only for the most serious crimes. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has referred to the most serious crimes as crimes of extreme gravity involving intentional killing. I'm happy that today we have one of the members from the committee will be speaking. I will introduce later on. There is no evidence that death penalty deters drug-related crimes more than other method of punishment or that in effect crimes reduction. Imposing the death penalty for drug-related offenses can have a disproportionate impact on the marginalized population, foreign national, minorities, and women. In some situations, it has been entailed a lack of transparency, breaches of the right to fair trial, and it has subjected individuals to ill treatment and torture while on death row. I would like to mention one thing you'll see in the Harm Reduction International report, that 34 countries still continue to use death penalty. Mainly 34 countries in their law books, they have death penalty. Some of them regularly using death penalty, some of them occasionally, and some country they have in the book, but they do not use the death penalty for a long time. But mere existence of the death penalty in law book, it creates stigma in the society, particularly people who use drugs and other community. It creates some sort of fear in the society. And that's need to be also, I think, addressed. Instead that retain the death penalty should refrain from using it for drug-related offenses, consider abolishing it for such offenses and commute death sentences that have already been handed down. That is our key recommendation in the report. I have a copy of the reports, our report summary. If you'd like to take copy, please, at the end of the meeting, even this side, even you can collect from here. With that note, I would like to invite Deputy Ambassador from Ghana to make her introductory remarks. Also, I would like to mention one thing with regard to Ghana. That Ghana was the last country in the world abolished the death penalty in the last year. I would like to applaud for that, for Ghana's needs for that one. Thank you, Ambassador. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the kind words said about Ghana. We really appreciate it. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I deem it a great honor to give the opening remarks for this important session and an important topic at the CND. Permit me to express appreciation to the organizers for the invitation. I bring you warm greetings and best wishes for this event from Ambassador Johnson, Chair of the CND, who could not join us this morning due to some pressing issues which requires his urgent attention. Last year, Ghana's parliament voted to abolish the death penalty for all offenses, a move that was applauded by many human rights activists globally as a great advancement of the human rights record of Ghana. Abolishing the death penalty shows that we are determined as a society not to be inhuman, uncivil, closed, retrogressive, and dark, and reflects our common belief that the sanctity of life is inviolable. I believe that it is with a sense of responsibility and a commitment to justice that we gather here today to address a matter of great significance, the death penalty for drug-related offenses. Ghana recognizes the gravity of this issue and the complexities surrounding it. As we delve into the challenges inherent in its application and explore pathways towards its abolition, we do so with a firm belief in upholding human rights, promoting fairness, and advancing the cause of justice. The use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses presents a myriad of challenges, both legal and ethical. It is a practice that has sparked considerable debate on its effectiveness as a deterrent, its compatibility with international human rights standards, and its potential for wrongful convictions. Moreover, its applications often intersect with other broader issues, such as socioeconomic disparities, access to justice, and systemic inequalities. Under international human rights law, capital punishment is only permission for most serious crimes. UN human rights bodies have made clear that this should only be applied to crimes of extreme gravity involving intentional killing, and that this does not include drug trafficking. And of course, there is now a growing majority of countries voting regularly for a moratorium on the death penalty in the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. As we confront these challenges, we must approach the issue with a critical eye and a commitment to finding effective solutions. This requires a comprehensive examination of the underlying factors driving drug offenses, including the socioeconomic conditions that may contribute to involvement in drug-related activities, as well as the effectiveness of alternative sentencing measures in addressing the root causes of drug-related crimes. Furthermore, it is essential to engage in meaningful dialogue with stakeholders at all levels, including civil society organizations, legal experts, and international partners, to foster a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding this issue and to identify pragmatic pathways towards abolition. Excellencies, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, the government of Ghana is committed to promoting a justice system that is fair, transparent, and in line with international human rights standards. Hence, I would encourage all of us here today to be open-minded and have an honest conversation to finding solutions for this thorny issue presented to us at the CND. In closing, it is my fervent hope that these discussions will help us have an open and honest, evidence-based conversations about these big issues, especially around drugs. I thank you, Chair, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. And indeed, death penalty is an affront to right to life and other human rights. With that note, I would like to move to our panel. We have distinguished panelists here. I will introduce now first Ajeng Larasati. She's Human Rights Lead at the Harm Reduction International. I would like to also highlight that Harm Reduction International since 2007 is recording, mainly producing report on the death penalty for drug-related offenses. We have another organization also co-sponsoring this event or organizing this event together, Amnesty International. Amnesty International, yearly basis, they produce global situation with regard to death penalty for all crimes. But it is really great that Harm Reduction International focusing on death penalty for drug-related offenses. Ajeng, give us the latest update.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, despite the side event started at 8. My name is Ajeng Larasati, and today I will be presenting the data and trends on the application of the death penalty for drug offenses from our latest Global Overview 2023. I shared with some of you already the snapshots that we printed. We have some copies as well over there and some stickers. So maybe at the end of these events, we can share them with you more. So as Zafed also mentioned, we have been monitoring the use of the death penalty for drug offenses worldwide since 2007. And this report is actually our 13th on the subject. And it continues our work to provide regular updates on legislative policy, as well as practical developments related to the use of capital punishment for drug offenses, a practice which is a clear violation of international standards. Allow me to start with good news from the year, from 2023. 2023 started with 35 countries retained the death penalty for drug offenses, but closed with one less. Pakistan took the landmark decision when the country removed death as possible punishment for drug offenses and effectively became the first country to abolish the death penalty for drug offenses in over a decade in Asia. The year also saw a reduction in the number of countries applying mandatory death sentences for drug offenses with Malaysia reform, which our colleague Edmund will provide a deeper analysis on the reform later. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, the slide will. Okay, perfect. So moving on to the bad news, a record high number of drug-related execution is documented in 2023. And you can see it from the screen above. At least 467 people are executed for drug offenses last year. And this represents a 44 increase from 2022. At least 59 of them belong to ethnic minority groups. 13 individuals were foreign nationals and 6 were women. As last year and years before, information gaps persist. There could have been more executions for drug offenses took place last year, but lack of transparency prevents us from getting the complete picture of the situation. Next, please. And drug offenses were responsible for roughly 42% of all executions confirmed globally throughout 2023. This means almost 1 in every 2 executions are for drug-related offenses. And this is the highest recorded figure since 2016. Next, please. As in previous years, unofficial reports and sources, as well as past practice, strongly suggest that executions for drug offenses were conducted in China, North Korea, and Vietnam. And you can see on the screen, there are 4 other countries that carried out execution for drug offenses in 2023. This is Iran, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Kuwait. Almost among those confirmed to have been executed in China are a South Korean and 2 Filipino nationals, despite pleading for clemency by their respective governments. Nevertheless, no accurate figures can be confirmed due to opacity and censorship on the part of state authorities. Next, please. And as you can see, 98% of known drug-related executions took place in Iran. This indicates a 79% increase from 2022, and actually the highest number we recorded from Iran since 2015. Drug executions accounted for at least 55% of total executions in the country. And this means drug control drives imposition of capital punishment by one of the world's top executioners. Next, please. With regards to death sentences, HRI's monitoring indicates that courts in at least 16 countries sentence individuals to death for violations of drug control legislation. Although official and reliable information on sentences is even more scarce than on executions, these figures are to be understood as a partial representations of the phenomenon. You can see from the screen which are the 16 countries that sentence people for that for drug offenses. Confirmed that sentences for drug offenses increased by more than 20% from 2022. A minimum of 375 people were sentenced to death for drug offenses, of which at least 31 were foreign nationals and 15 were women. A major spike in drug-related death sentences was observed in some countries such as Iran, Sri Lanka, Palestine, and Yemen. On the other hand, a decrease in death sentences was recorded in some countries, though none of them provide official figures. The most prominent one is Malaysia, which again, Edmund will probably touch on that later. And lastly, available figures suggest that drug control is the key driver of the use of the death penalty in many retentionist countries. For example, 94% of known death sentences imposed in Indonesia, my country, were for drug offenses. And this number rises to 100 in United Arab Emirates. Punitive drug control also has a significant impact on the death row population in several countries. And you can see on the screen, these are the percentage of death row for drug offenses against total people on death row. Drug offenses accounted for 52% of people on death row in Indonesia, about 55% in Malaysia, 61% in Thailand, and 95% in Singapore. Can we go to the next slide, please? Almost there. Other key findings from the year. 2023 saw a number of commutations and pardons in favor of individuals sentenced to death for drug offenses, in addition to those in Malaysia pursuant to the legal reform. In Indonesia, our president granted clemency to Mary Utami, who's been on death row for 20 years, more than 20 years. We also recorded a commutation in Bahrain and in Kuwait, as well as in United Arab Emirates. We also saw a strong stance against the imposition of capital punishment for drug offenses in 2023 by international actors. And this includes, among others, AICHR report launched last year, which Zafet mentioned it earlier today. However, the UN body responsible for drug matters, unfortunately, continued to remain silent, and hopefully they can break the silence from now on. Next, please. Okay, so yes, this is my last slide. I want to close by sharing an event that could be an opportunity for us to continue the work to abolish the death penalty for drug offenses, which is the International Harm Reduction Conference, which will be held in Colombia next year. In previous conference, we invited representatives from Malaysia to share updates on the reform they undertook. And this time in Bogota, although no Latin American countries retain death penalty for drug offenses, the past few years has seen Latin American countries being a strong advocate for abolition of the death penalty for drug offenses, which is a very good move from the countries in Latin America. And hopefully more countries are joining them in the fight against the use of the death penalty for drug offenses. I'll end it there, Zafet. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation of the report and findings. We can see the mixed picture, some positive development as well as continuation of execution or sentencing people to death for drug-related offenses in many countries. But one thing you mentioned, I would like to highlight that transparency, because all this figure which has been provided it's not complete figure.
Yes.
It's not complete figure because many countries, we do not have information from many countries because lack of transparency, or as we mentioned, that it's considered as a state secret, the death penalty issue. So obviously it doesn't provide full picture to us. One thing also I would like to remind everyone, these are not only the figure, every figure has behind it an individual, a family, or maybe whole society. So we need to also think when we are looking at those figures, but behind that humanity as well. That one. With that note, I would like to move to our next speaker, Edmund, Mr. Edmund Bohm. He's the head of chamber of one leading law chamber in Malaysia, AmerBON Advocates, and he was also former member or representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Mr. Edmund, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, delegates, excellencies. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I have no PowerPoint slide. I have no data to share except to speak about what I've been asked to present, which in brief, it's about Malaysia's pathway towards abolishing the mandatory nature of the death penalty that has recently been enforced. The abolishment has been enforced since 2023. I think at this type of conference where this is the first time I'm joining this conference, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs, it's very eye-opening. And but I understand a lot of the delegates and the discussions center around law enforcement. And I think I've been invited to try and make the link between how human rights are respected or should be respected and violated in terms of law enforcement, specifically in relation to drug offences. So in Malaysia's pathway, we have seen some significant progress, and it's been over, I would say, a relatively short period of time, 6 to about 8 years. The last known execution in Malaysia, and since then there has been a moratorium in 2016. The campaign to abolish the death penalty completely has been largely spearheaded by the Bar Council of Malaysia, independent lawyers association, where all of us need to be a member of to become a lawyer in Malaysia. And we started that campaign many years ago, working with different NGOs, including NGOs like Amnesty, AdPen, and individual lawyers to remove the death penalty from our statute books. Of course, the advocacy has been to abolish it completely, and especially in cases of drug trafficking. So in Malaysia, we had the mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking, and we had, as part of the campaign, there were many high-profile cases which were highlighted and which you would probably have read regarding drug trafficking and how the punishment of mandatory death penalty was deemed to be unfair and unjust because you would apply the death penalty across the board for all types of drug trafficking cases. Then in 2017, Malaysia introduced amendments to the Dangerous Drugs Act, which allowed a discretion to the public prosecutor to reduce the sentence from death penalty to merely imprisonment. And then we had a political change because the government changed from the ruling Barisan Nasional government to Pakatan Harapan government, the opposition then, in 2018. And in 2018 really was the start, or at least an active move by the government to consider the abolishment of the death penalty completely. I think that was the statements from the government, and it was led by the late Liu Wee-Kyong, who passed on unfortunately, but he had led this push for the government, continuing the moratorium of executions first, and then with cabinet bringing a new level of transparency in the figures and sharing of information as to who was on death row, in although not a highly systematic way, but in a very ad hoc way, was a good sign about how the government was a bit more open than other governments in talking about the challenges in dealing with the problem, and to try and create a greater understanding of who was in death row, for what crimes, and for analysis of how legal aid would impact a lot of these people, as well as looking at their socio-economic backgrounds. So for drug trafficking cases, you would be seeing that a lot of the accused persons, a lot of those people who were accused of crime and who were on death row came from poor, vulnerable groups, not only Malaysians, but foreigners as well. Many of them were mules, doing it whether intentionally or unintentionally as drug couriers, and yet they would be sentenced to the mandatory death penalty. I think what was very important is that Malaysian government took the strategy of outsourcing the expertise, and then that provided a buffer as a strategy. I think looking back, it provided a buffer to government because it was allowed to say, look, I've appointed a group of experts. And this happened in 2019. The government set up a special committee to review all offences relating to the death penalty, where there was a death penalty, and that of course included drug trafficking. So I was on the committee, was led by the former Chief Justice Tun Richard Malanjum, with a whole group of experts from prisons, from the prosecution side, and we did road shows as well as consultations in the whole country. And we were studying what the report called alternatives to the mandatory death penalty. It allowed us really for the first time to get into the nitty-gritty of law enforcement, as well as into the personalities of the accused persons, as well as the families that were affected, because we also have death penalty for kidnapping, for murder. And this nationwide consultation was very enriching. It was a very comprehensive report. We had comments from agencies all over. There were, of course, objections, but we dealt with those objections. Unfortunately, much as I would like it, I've been asking the government to try and declassify the report. I cannot speak very much about the report, but because it's still an official secret for one reason or another. But that report had very comprehensive recommendations, not only to abolish first the mandatory death penalty, which we have now done in 2023, but recommendations in the journey towards abolishing death penalty completely in the near future. So those recommendations included further studies, consultations, included more on-the-ground work with UN agencies, including UNODC. But in the meantime, and this is, I think, to respond to Ajeng's intervention, is that we had actually also spoken about a sentencing council. So the sentencing council for judges are actually very important, because while the death penalty is still in place in Malaysia, and we see some figures of where the High Court, the trial court, still imposes a death penalty based on judicial discretion. Of course, it's less, but still happening. Yet, I think we are requiring more of a judicial guideline as to what type of sentences, in the rarest of rare cases, should the death penalty be imposed. So the move towards removing mandatory death penalty eventually led to laws now being enforced in 2023 by Parliament. This was really due to the leadership of the current government, which engaged many stakeholders over a short period of time to ensure the reforms are in place. The removal of the mandatory death penalty now is coupled with our recommendation for resentencing. So we have about 1,000 over prisoners who are now who have been sentenced to the death penalty, who are now going to have their cases reviewed by the highest court, the federal court, to be resentenced. The good news is for all drug trafficking cases where the review has been happening, the Attorney General, public prosecutor has not been objecting to the reduction of the sentences in respect of drug trafficking cases. So that, I think, is a very positive step. Of course, the public prosecutor is still objecting to the use of the death penalty in other cases like murder or in more serious offenses. But for drug trafficking, what I understand from my colleagues, and we are doing some as well, is that the public prosecutor has not been objecting to that. I think the other point that is important about this whole process where the government outsourced it to a group of experts is that not only the bills had abolished the mandatory death penalty, but they had completely removed death penalty. Our recommendations, which have been accepted, have completely removed the death penalty as punishment for 7 offences. So as part of the process, while we were looking at the mandatory death penalty, not only has the mandatory nature been taken away, but death penalty completely has been removed. We also, as part of the recommendations, had recommended that imprisonment for natural life. So we have a natural life imprisonment punishment. Imprisonment for natural life has to be removed as well. So there's no, in Malaysia now, there is no imprisonment for natural life. It's a fixed term that is set. And then, of course, the process for resentencing. So a lot of these progress, I think, is a combination of a lot of different factors. There's still much work to do in the journey towards abolishing the death penalty. I want to acknowledge as well, 2 days ago, at this conference, my colleague from the Ministry of Home Affairs, who's here now at government, represented us and made very positive and progressive statements about the same thing that I'm mentioning about how we have moved towards removing the mandatory death penalty and how we are also looking at, I understand the government is also looking at decriminalizing one poison, one drug, towards trying to deal with issues such as overcrowding in prisons, overburdening of the judicial system. So in essence, I just wanted to end there to say that the data about how the death penalty does not deter crime, death penalty targets the vulnerable, it's all there and has been shown in Malaysia. And if there's enough political will, enough pressure, enough cooperation and consultation with stakeholders, we can move towards this journey in removing the death penalty completely for all offences. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Edmund, for your remarks. And it's really important to understand the process, how country is moving forward to abolish the mandatory death penalty, in some cases also abolishing the death penalty for all crimes. One of the key role played by the committee which was established, and the report, I'm sure it is valuable would be for everyone. In this regard also, I would like to recognize the Ghana also conducted this kind of review by the Constitutional Commission. Ghana had a constitution, and the report was published and provided to the public as well as to the government, and that led to the abolition last year. So I think it is really critical that this report being published, and that could also help other countries as well, that to see how one particular country is moving forward, and it could be lesson learned for others as well, or as a good example. So we hope that government of Malaysia will publish this report declassified that report. With that note, I would like to move to our next speaker, Hélène Tigroudja. She's joining us online. And I mentioned the Human Rights Committee before, the UN Human Rights Committee, which monitor the implementation of the one international human rights treaty, that is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And Hélène is part of that committee which monitor this treaty. With that note, also before I hand over to Hélène, I would like to acknowledge the participants who are participating online. I can see the number now, 21. It's a really good number at 8 o'clock in the morning, just joining from different parts of the world. Welcome to all of you who are joining online. With that note, Hélène, over to you. And I'm looking forward to see you tomorrow. You're coming here tomorrow and after tomorrow you'll be here. Over to you, Hélène.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me as a member of the Human Rights Committee, and especially to share the experience of the Human Rights Committee when dealing with death penalty and drug offenses. And actually my remarks are really similar to what was said by Harm Reduction International. We have the same kind of picture or experience, also positive news, but also concerns when dealing with drug offenses. So my remarks are really similar. And I was really pleased to hear what was said by the opening remarks, and it's Ghana, I think, has really a leading role to play. So I was really, really happy to hear what was said at the very beginning of our discussion. So maybe 5 or 6 bullet points, I would say. So first, indeed, it was reminded at the beginning of this panel that Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, dealing with the right to life, does not in itself prohibit the death penalty. But the Human Rights Committee made very clear, especially in its General Comment 36, that death penalty must only be applied for the most serious crimes. And actually, when we have state parties review, we have a lot of discussion on this scope of most serious crimes. And we might have, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples, we might have disagreement, because for some states very recently, and I think it was mentioned, we had the review of Egypt, or we had the review of Iran or of Kuwait. And the position of the state is to say that indeed, maybe drug trafficking or drug users are not directly committed crimes, but it's extremely dangerous for the society. So for these states, these justify the implementation or the use of death penalty. So the work of the Human Rights Committee, when we have states dialogue, is really to explain that actually, when we talk about most serious crimes, we talk about intentional killing. So we are not, the Human Rights Committee does not accept this very broad interpretation of this category of most serious crimes. But here we have an issue, and I was very happy also to hear what was said by the first speaker on from Harm Reduction International, because some states said, okay, we have our obligation under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but we have also the obligation under especially the Convention against Organized Crime. So it's also our duty to fight against drug trafficking and so on. And for us, and that's where we need UNODC, for us, it's extremely difficult to make clear that states' obligation under human rights obligation, under human rights treaties, must be combined with states' obligation under Convention on or against organized crime. So indeed, between Vienna and Geneva, we need to talk with one voice, because states in general use these other international treaties dealing with organized crime to justify the limitation or restriction of human rights. So it's really an important point that was already mentioned by our first panelist. The second element that is, I think it was not mentioned, but it's a trend also we see in some of the dialogues we have, is not only the use of criminal legislation or death penalty for drug users or drug traffickers, but it's also the misuse of this legislation. So sometimes, and we raised the point with at least one of the states, sometimes there is a sort of instrumentalization of legislation against drug trafficking vis-à-vis, for instance, marginalized persons, or to fight against LGBT persons. So in order to criminalize LGBT persons, states might use this legislation against drug trafficking, and people, for instance, LGBT people, are accused of drug trafficking, even if they are not drug traffickers or drug users. So we see also this tendency, this trend of misuse of this criminal legislative body. So it's extremely important for the Human Rights Committee to make clear that first, we cannot use criminal law, and especially with death penalty, for offenses that do not fall under this most serious crimes category. And it's prohibited to misuse or to use this type of legislation as a way to fight against marginalized group or to fight against minorities group, and so on and so forth. And we had very recently 1, 2, or 3 examples. Our conversation with states when it's about death penalty and drug offenses is not only focused on right to life, but it was already said, we also, it also triggers the violation of other rights protected by the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Protection against torture, ill treatment, and so on. Indeed, condition of detention in death row is really a big issue, a big concern for the Human Rights Committee. But not only, I would say, basic condition of detention. We are also developing, alongside with the European Court of Human Rights or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, positive obligations. So states have positive obligations when people deprived of liberty, for instance, are drug users or drugged. So it's not only about, having a sort of minimum standard of condition of detention, but it's also about developing positive obligation. For instance, access to medicines, access to alternative medicines, access to health, access to mental health also, and so on and so forth. So it's also an extremely important point. Third element, it was already said, mandatory death penalty. It's a big concern for the Human Rights Committee. We consider that there are too many states, even if there is a sort of positive trend, but there are too many states that still apply mandatory death penalty in situation of drug trafficking. And so for the Human Rights Committee, it's not only a violation of the right to life, but it's also a violation of the right to a fair trial, so Article 14 of the Covenant. And here we have, depending on the states, but we have many, many critical issues. So mandatory death penalty, but also what we see is, in general, fair trial is absolutely not respected, defense rights. For instance, we have a lot of examples of forced confession and trials based on forced confession, lack of access to lawyers, lack of access to medical staff, and so on and so forth. So for the Human Rights Committee, it's extremely clear that when there is a death sentence without the basic judicial guarantees, the death sentence is arbitrary. So even if, you know, it's in the legal system, it's in the criminal legislation, for the Human Rights Committee, this is an arbitrary deprivation of life. So states must be extremely cautious in terms of not only their legislative framework, but also access to justice, access to a fair trial, independent bodies, prohibition of forced confession during the detention, and so on and so forth. So it's extremely important to make the connection between fair trial and the protection of life. And if the accused is a foreigner, for instance, the Human Rights Committee does insist, and not only the Human Rights Committee, there are also decisions and positions by the African Court on Human and People's Rights or the Inter-American Court. We also insist on consular protection. So it's extremely important also to bring to the person, to the accused, consular information, consular support in the criminal process. Transparency, I'm not going to elaborate, but it's also a very important point. We lack, in many of the dialogue we have with states, we lack transparent and reliable information, statistics, and so on. It was already mentioned, so I'm not going to develop the point, but I fully agree with what was said. Maybe a final point I would like to also bring to the attention to delegates and colleagues is the sentence and also the commutation of sentence. So we have in some states, when the states do accept not to apply death penalty, we have the commutation of sentence. But for the Human Rights Committee, if instead of death penalty, we have a life sentence without any hope to be released, without any hope to be granted a sort of pardon, it might fall under the category of an ill treatment. So we recently, and it's a public decision, we recently adopted in 2022 a case, Aliyev versus Ukraine, where the Human Rights Committee made very clear that indeed it's very good when we have commutation of death sentence to deprivation of liberty sentence. But again, it must be accompanied by at least the possibility to be granted pardon. Otherwise, for the Human Rights Committee, if it's a life sentence without any possibility of release or hope or possibility to request, it's a violation of prohibition of torture and ill treatment. So it's also important to send this message to states that indeed, if they go in this direction of suspending, withdrawing death sentence, it's also important to organize a sentencing regime that is respectful of prohibition of torture and ill treatment. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to arriving in Geneva, in Vienna in a couple of hours. Thank you.
Appreciate that you set out the human rights framework and discussion at the Human Rights Committee. With that note, I would like to open the floor very briefly. I'm conscious about the time. I see that colleagues already standing for the next event, but just a few minutes. I would like to give floor to our colleague from Canada, permanent mission here. Please, over to you briefly. One of the co-sponsors of the event.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I just wanted to take the floor briefly this morning to thank you, Chair. Thanks to the organizers, Harm Reduction International and Amnesty, and also to our panelists for sharing your experience and expertise today. Canada's very proud to be supporting this side event. and to be more generally part of this critical discussion on the use of capital punishment in response to drug-related offenses. I'm very encouraged to see such strong support and engagement by both member states and civil society on this issue. And as the panelists have outlined this morning very effectively, just as the criminalization of drugs has failed to curb drug use, evidence demonstrates that the death penalty fails to deter drug crime. I don't think it'll come as any surprise that Canada unequivocally condemns the use of the death penalty in all cases. We abolished the death penalty in law and in practice a long time ago because we believe it is incompatible with human rights and human dignity and can lead to irreversible injustice when innocent people are executed. And as was mentioned by several speakers, including just now by Hélène, those with intersecting identities are often disproportionately targeted, including on the basis of gender, race, disability, and other identity factors. So just to conclude, Canada firmly believes that we cannot begin to grapple with persistent challenges to restricting the use of the death penalty, or even to discuss pathways towards abolition without taking an intersectional approach. So we remain committed to working with all of you towards a world free of this inhumane punishment. And thanks again for putting on such a terrific event this morning.
Thank you very much, colleague from Canadian Permanent Mission. I take your statement as a concluding remarks and concluding this event. Thank you very much.